Britain began a period of major rearmament in 1937, but it was seriously weighted towards the IAF and Royal Navy. The Army placed urgent orders for the new tank designs, but there was not enough time or industrial capacity to turn them into reality. Work had to be given to a wider group of commercial companies with no prior experience of tank building, resulting in slow production and quality control issues. The vast majority of tanks delivered were the virtually useless light tank Mk6. The newly established Royal Armoured Corps had only 143 infantry tanks and cruisers available in September 1939. They lacked spares and equipment, and very few crews had been trained to fight with them. The campaign in France in 1940 quickly revealed how ill-equipped Britain's tank force was. The cruisers and light tanks lacked the armor to withstand German anti-tank guns. The tougher Matildas were more effective and caused brief alarm to the Germans during the Anglo-French counterattack at Arras. But such actions only delayed the inevitable, and all British tanks in France were either destroyed or abandoned in the retreat. Brigadier Vivian Pope, tank advisor to the commander of the British Expeditionary Force Lord Gort, reported back on the consequences of poor tactics and equipment. Piecemeal attacks against concentrated German forces were bound to fail. Reliability was a major concern, with many tanks breaking down on long road marches. Most vital of all was the need for better protection and hitting power. We must have thicker armor on our fighting tanks, and every tank must carry a cannon. The 2 PDI is good enough now, but only just. We must mount something better and put it behind 40 to 80 millimeters of armor. A fundamental problem was that the width of British tanks had to keep within the limits of the standard railway gauge for transportation. And unlike those of Germany and other nations, British designs kept the fighting compartment slung between the tracks and suspension to give the tank a lower overall profile. This constrained the diameter of the turret ring, which in turn affected the size of the turret and gun that could be fitted. Weight was an issue too, and tanks had to be light enough to be shipped overseas and use standard military bridges. All of this meant that there was no way of easily upgrading existing tanks, or improving those still on the drawing board. Another wider factor was a complex and bureaucratic organization behind tank design and production. The old Tank Design Department of the War Office, set up in 1931, had never had much say over the designs offered by Vickers. Its task had been to issue specifications and suggest improvements to the final products, a situation which continued as Britain rearmed and other firms were brought into tank production. In August 1939, the new Ministry of Supply took over responsibility for the supply of weapons to the Army. Its key objective was to galvanize production, especially the supply of tanks, but it meant even less collaboration between producers and end users. A new Directorate of Tank Design was established, but once again, it was to act as consultant and had only limited influence over what the manufacturers came up with. In an attempt to coordinate tank development and production, a new committee, the Tank Board, was set up in 1940. On it were representatives from the Ministry of Supply, the War Office, and the manufacturers. At first it served only to advise and report, and there were frequent changes of chairman, members, and terms of reference. Only slowly was it given more executive powers over design and procurement. Not until the end of 1942 was tank policy properly synchronized between the War Office, Ministry of Supply, and the manufacturers. Quantity over quality. Tank supply continued to be affected by the artificial division between infantry tanks and cruisers, and the imposition of changing War Office requirements. In December 1939, in anticipation of refighting the First World War, the General Staff had demanded that 2/3 of production be given over to infantry tanks. A year later, after experiences in France, priority was given to the development of cruiser tanks. Light tank production had been quickly terminated and the divisional reconnaissance role taken over by armored cars. Cruisers would equip the armored divisions or independent armored brigades for mobile operations, while infantry tanks were grouped in separate tank brigades for infantry support. This basic division remained in place for the rest of the war. Whatever the Army's operational requirements, production took precedence over design in the early years of the war. A massive increase in production was needed to make good the losses suffered in France and to provide for Britain's defense. Winston Churchill himself ordered maximum production of existing designs, whether good or bad. 1,379 tanks were built in 1940, outstripping the Germans. One unfortunate consequence was that development of a more powerful tank gun was also delayed. Design of the new 6PDR was already complete, but production of the 2PDR could not be interrupted. The 6PDR would not be fitted into a British tank until May 1942. This focus on quantity over quality was the main reason the next two cruiser tanks, which entered service in 1941, were built in such large numbers despite very obvious flaws. Both were in the design stage of the outbreak of war and were built around the now obsolete 2PDR. The A-13 Covenanter was a low-profile, heavy cruiser derivative of the original A-13. Ordered off the drawing board in April 1939, it was nothing less than a spectacular failure. The tank was plagued by engine cooling problems that were never resolved, and it had to be relegated to training duties. The A-15 Crusader was another development of the A-13. Rushed into production without adequate development trials or quality control, it quickly gained a reputation for unreliability. It was a principal British tank in the Western Desert Campaign, where the sand and heat exacerbated its mechanical problems. The war in North Africa was a major testing ground where all the flaws in British tank design, organization, and tactics were brutally exposed. Initial success against the Italians was encouraging. Once again, the Matilda Mk2's tough hide proved resistant to enemy weapons, but the reign of the so-called Queen of the Desert was soon ended by the larger caliber anti-tank guns of the German Afrika Korps, especially the lethal 88mm. The cruisers did well at first too, racing across the desert in pursuit of fleeing Italians. But in later battles against the Germans, they were decimated while making suicidal attacks against anti-tank gun screens without infantry support. The British tanks were unable to respond to this threat effectively because the 2PDR couldn't fire a powerful enough high-explosive round. Trying to fire accurately on the move, in accordance with British doctrine, also proved impossible. German tanks wisely preferred to fire while stationary. The standard German tanks of the time were not significantly better, but had more effective optics and crew layouts. They could also be more easily upgunned to keep them effective. Thus, by 1942, the PZ-kit PFW-3 sported a high-velocity 50mm gun, and some PZ-kit PFW-4s were fitted with an even more effective long 75mm gun. In 1942, the Crusader was also finally upgunned with a 6PDR, but this required reducing the turret crew to 2, and its lack of durability remained a major problem. The Crusader's failure in particular led to Britain requesting supplies of American tanks, of which the M3 Grant and later the M4 Sherman were the most effective. Both were equipped with a dual-purpose 75mm gun, which significantly increased hitting power against German tanks, and also gave British crews a chance to knock out dug-in anti-tank guns and other soft targets. Despite the general staff preference for cruisers, production of infantry tanks continued in the early years of the war, and two major new designs came into service. The Valentine was a private venture by Vickers and ordered into production as war loomed. Once again, its small turret was a major drawback, but could at a pinch take the 6PDR, provided again that one of the crew was left out. The Valentine was used both as an infantry tank and cruiser, and unusually for a British tank, was very reliable. It was built in greater numbers than any other British design, with many of these being shipped to the Soviet Union. The most famous infantry tank of the war was the A-22 Churchill, which stemmed from a 1939 specification for a large First World War-type tank suitable for another bout of trench warfare. In 1940, the design was refined by Vauxhall Motors and ordered in production as urgently as possible. But the Churchill suffered reliability problems at first and needed a major program of modifications before it was ready for action. By the later stages of the North African campaign, the infantry tank concept had fallen from favor. Mobility was now prioritized over protection. However, the need to keep production running at full tilt meant that Matildas, Valentines, and Churchills were churned out in large numbers at the cost of other more promising tanks then in development. 8,700 of the 13,459 tanks produced in 1941 and 1942 were infantry tanks. The Churchill, due for retirement in 1943, gained a reprieve after proving its ability to cope with the hilly terrain of Tunisia. Its thick armor also gave it an advantage, and it soldiered on for the rest of the war, from cruiser to universal tank. Meanwhile, the search for a more effective cruiser tank continued. After the Battle of France, the War Office had issued a specification for a new tank with thicker armor and a turret big enough to take the 6PDR gun. It was to be in production by the spring of 1942. A design by Nuffield Mechanization and Aero was chosen, known as the A24 Cavalier, using the Liberty engine and many of the components from the old Crusader. Unsurprisingly, given its parentage, the Cavalier was a disaster. It was afflicted by the same lubrication and cooling problems that blighted the earlier tank, and development was eventually abandoned. More promisingly, Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company had been proceeding with its own version, later designated the A27M Cromwell. It was powered by a new engine, the 600-horsepower Meteor, which was derived from the famous Merlin aircraft engine. The Meteor promised much greater power and reliability, but the Ministry of Aircraft Production refused to make them available before its own demands had been met. It was not until late 1942 that supplies were assured. The shortage of Meteor engines meant that Leyland Motors was tasked to provide a third variant of the new tank, the A27L Centaur, fitted with an upgraded Liberty engine. The Centaur's development ran parallel to that of the Cromwell, but reliability issues meant it continually struggled in service trials. Like the Cavalier, it was never accepted as a frontline tank. In total, 503 Cavaliers and 1,821 Centaurs were built, which represented a colossal waste of time and resources at a crucial time for British tank development. The Army also tried and failed to get Valentine and Crusader production reduced to speed up the Cromwell program. The need to avoid disrupting tank supply with abrupt factory changeovers meant that 1,650 Crusaders and 1,798 Valentines were built in 1943 alone, compared to 532 Cromwells. Only in 1944 was a new cruiser finally given priority, and other firms brought in to accelerate production. The Cromwell, effectively 2 years late, was only just ready in time for D-Day. The Cromwell's complex protracted development meant that by the time it entered service, it was already obsolete. Its armor compared badly to that of its German counterparts, especially the new Tiger and Panther. Ironically, it was never fitted with the 6 PDR, the weapon for which it had been designed. The need for a good dual-purpose gun meant it received instead the British Ordnance QF 75mm gun, effectively a 6 PDR board-out to take the US 75mm round. So despite the Cromwell speed and reliability, which were a definite boon during the pursuit operations in the last year of the war, it was always undergunned and unable to withstand the heaviest German weapons. This was all the more frustrating because a gun was now available that promised to reverse British inferiority at a stroke. Artillery development had always been well ahead of tank design in Britain, and work had begun on a replacement for the 6 PDR in 1941. This new weapon, the 3-inch 17 PDR, became one of the best anti-tank guns of the war, able to penetrate the thickest armor at normal battle ranges. The first versions on modified field gun carriages were rushed out to Tunisia in May 1943 to combat the new German Tiger tank. But such was its size that it could not be fitted into any existing British tank. The 17 PDR's effectiveness inspired the War Office to call for a new tank to be built around it. The first proposal was the A30 Challenger, basically a stretched Cromwell with a bulky new turret. The new tank was badly designed. Its armor had to be reduced to allow for the weight of the gun, which meant it was less protected than a standard Cromwell. Other problems dogged development, and it was not ready in time for D-Day. Fortunately, another option had presented itself. It had been discovered that with a little ingenuity, the 17 PDR could be made to fit just into a Sherman. The result was a Sherman Firefly, the most significant British tank adaptation of the war. The Firefly provided a desperately needed extra punch for the armored regiments in the Northwest Europe campaign, but there were never enough of them. Being based on a standard Sherman, they remained very vulnerable to enemy fire, but they finally gave British tank crews a chance to outpace and outshoot the German Panthers and Tigers that dominated the European battlefield. The successor to the Cromwell and the ultimate British cruiser was the A34 Comet. Specified in 1943, it was to have a new 75mm high-velocity HV gun built by Vickers. The caliber was later changed to 76.2mm and became known as a 77mm HV. This gun was more compact than the 17 PDR but just as effective and gave the tank hitting power equal to the Panther. Inevitably, development was slow. It was the best British tank to see service, but only in the last months of the war. By 1944, British tank development and production had matured considerably. The Department of Tank Design's influence and expertise had significantly grown, and was now at last living up to its name. The requirement to produce outdated designs to keep numbers up had finally been dropped. Production was now mostly standardized on Cromwells, Comets, and Churchills, and the number of firms involved reduced from 27 to 11. This was only possible because of the continuing reliance on the Sherman, 8,000 of which were imported in 1944 and 1945. Industrial techniques had improved and manufacturing processes simplified. Britain finally caught up with other nations and started to use welding instead of riveting, which made for lighter, stronger hulls and turrets. The British reputation for shoddy construction and unreliability was overturned, and the Cromwell and Comet were a world away from the Covenanter and Crusader in this regard. There were other projects, including wasteful plans to develop a class of heavily armored assault tanks. The A-33 Excelsior, designed to replace the Churchill, was tested in 1943 and abandoned in 1944. The A-38 Valiant was an up-armored and up-gunned Valentine that never got beyond testing in 1944. The monstrous A-39 Tortoise weighed 78 tons and was an attempt to produce a tank resistant to the heaviest German guns, but the pilot models were only delivered after the war ended. The final significant development in Britain's wartime tank story was the A-41 Centurion. It began as an idea in 1942 for a tank that combined several battlefield roles. The Desert War had shown that pure cavalry-style tank versus tank combat predicted by the pre-war visionaries rarely occurred. Similarly, the infantry tank concept, believed in 1939 to be the most important, was too restrictive on a modern battlefield. Experience had taught instead that the main function of the tank was to act as mobile fire support in both attack and defense. With this in mind, the War Office and the Department of Tank Design looked towards a universal tank that could fulfill all these functions. By 1943, the old width and weight restrictions had been abandoned, and so designers had a free rein. The new tank was to have good cross-country performance, mount a 17 PDR gun, and be protected by thick, sloped armor able to resist the German 88mm gun. AEC was authorized to begin work in July 1943, but the war ended before it was finished. Too little too late? Apart from the moderate success of the Churchill and the later cruisers, the story of British wartime tank development is a sorry one. It had got off to a bad start as a result of insufficient pre-war funding and a lack of political and military drive to develop the armored forces. Uncertainty over the role of tanks led to the conflicting developmental powers of infantry tanks and cruisers. Defeat in 1940 prompted the panic building of inadequate designs, which impeded the development of more promising tanks. Rush production and design flaws led to reliability issues. External constraints meant tanks had limited capacity for future armament upgrades. From late 1942, U.S. tanks were required in increasing numbers to make up for the deficiencies of homegrown products. Only in 1944 was British industry able to deliver a tank reasonably fit for a fast-moving battlefield, and even then it was scarcely a match for its opponents. It can be argued that the Cromwell, and indeed the more numerous Sherman, gave Allied commanders greater operational flexibility than the Germans. The famous Tigers and Panthers may have been judged superior on the battlefield, but they were over-engineered, mechanically fragile, and too few in number. Mobility and reliability were more important to the advancing Allied armies. But tanks like the Cromwell and the Comet should have been available much earlier. The Soviet Union showed it could be done. The T-34, produced in 1940, was arguably the best tank of the war. From the very start, the T-34 achieved that crucial balance between armor, firepower, and mobility that eluded British tank designers for so long. It spurred the Germans to revitalize their own barely adequate tank force and embark on a technological arms race in which Britain quickly fell behind. British tank crews of the sharp end knew it only too well, and had every reason to bemoan the lack of protection and firepower which was a feature of their war. Language lessons became a top priority as most of the Polish pilots did not know a single word of English. Communication between British and Polish officers had to be carried out in French. The RAF also came up with a way to teach the newcomers British tactics. Pilots of numbers 302 and 303 squadrons were ordered to ride tricycles, all equipped with radio, speed indicators, and compasses around airfields and flying formations. The Poles, combat experienced and eager to fight, did not take that kind of approach very lightly. Pilot officer Jan Zumbash wrote in his memoirs, The British wasting so much of our time with their childish exercises when all of us had already won their wings. It soon became clear to the British that the Poles were extremely skilled pilots. In July 1940, the first Polish fighter pilots joined IAF squadrons. Flying Officer Antoni Ostowicz and Flight Lieutenant Wilhelm Pankratz were posted to No. 145 Squadron IAF on the 16th of July. 3 days later, Flying Officer Ostowicz scored the first Polish kill in the Battle of Britain by sharing a He-111 over Brighton. Unfortunately, he was also the first Polish pilot to die in the battle, shot down by Messerschmitt Bf 109 south of Swanage on the 11th of August. Finally, the Poles joined the battle against the Germans on equal terms. A total of 145 experienced and battle-hardened Polish airmen fought in the Battle of Britain. 79 airmen in various IAF squadrons, 32 in No. 302 Polish Fighter Squadron and 34 in No. 303 Polish Fighter Squadron. On the 13th of August, Hermann Göring launched the Luftwaffe all-out air assault on Britain. This day, called Adlertag, Eagle Day, was the first day of the Germans' Adlerangriff, Attack of the Eagles, operation. For the next few months, the IAF and the Luftwaffe would engage in a series of intense air battles as the Germans sought to destroy IAF Fighter Command and secure control of the skies over England ahead of their planned invasion. Polish pilots and IAF squadrons played a substantial part in all operations against the Luftwaffe in increasing numbers. One of the finest examples of their work was a remarkable feat accomplished by Sergeant Antoni Glowacki of No. 501 Squadron IAF, who on the 24th of August claimed 5 enemy bombers, which were shot down in 3 combat sorties over one day. He was one of only 3 pilots who achieved Ace in a Day status during the battle and recalls the day's actions in his memoirs. Suddenly a Defiant with a Messerschmitt 109 on its tail flashed across my path between me and the Junkers. I am now firing at the Messerschmitt and see my burst sink into its fuselage and wings. He is hit and goes down closer behind Defiant, which trails black smoke. Both aircraft crash into the sea below. Meanwhile, the pilots of No. 303, Polish Fighter Squadron, were awaiting action with growing desperation. Most of them were experienced veterans of the Polish and French campaigns. After weeks of training on bicycles at IAF Northolt, the pilots finally got a chance to prove themselves in combat. On the 30th of August, 6 of the unit's Hurricanes took off on a routine interception exercise to carry out a mock attack on 6 Blenheim bombers in the Street Albans area. One of the pilots, Flying Officer Ludwig Paschkiewicz, describes the action in an official report. After a while, we noticed they had a number of aircraft carrying out various evaluations. I reported to the commanding officer, SRLDR Squadron Leader Kellett, by the ROT radio telephone, and, as he did not seem to reply, I opened up the throttle and went in the direction of the enemy. Then I noticed, at my own altitude, a bomber with twin rudders, probably a Dornier, turning in my direction. Then I aimed at the fuselage and opened fire from about 200 yards, later transferring it to the port engine, which I set on fire. The Dornier dived and then hit the ground without pulling out, or the dive and burst into flames. I had been firing at an enemy aircraft for the first time in my life. On his return to Northolt, Flying Officer Paschkiewicz was reprimanded for breaking discipline and congratulated on his and the squadron's first victory. The next day, the squadron was declared fully operational and posted to No. 11 Group. This episode was immortalized in the famous repeat, please seen in the classic 1969 film, Battle of Britain. In the following weeks, the squadron achieved a truly astonishing score of 126 enemy planes, as well as 13 probables and 9 damage, claiming the title of the best scoring unit of the Battle of Britain. One of their extraordinary feats was shooting down 14 enemy planes, plus 4 probables, in one sortie over London on the 7th of September, the first day of the Blitz, without a single loss on their side. 9 of the squadron's pilots qualified as aces for shooting down 5 or more enemy planes. One of them was Sergeant Josef František, a Czech who called himself a Pole and preferred to fly with Poles. With a personal score of 17 enemy planes, he was the top scorer of the Battle of Britain. 4 of the Polish officers were awarded Distinguished Flying Crosses after the battle, amongst them Flying Officer Witold Obernowicz, the Polish commander of No. 303 Squadron, and one of the best scorers with 15 kills. In the Battle of Britain, Polish pilots serving in all IAF squadrons achieved a remarkable score of 203.5 destroyed, 35 probables, and 36 damaged. Other sources give 131 kills, as there is generally variation in figures for claimed kills. The entire IAF score was lowered from 2,692 to 1,733 aircraft destroyed due to the discrepancy between British and German official figures. Such a feat could not be achieved without a price. 29 Polish pilots, including Ludwik Paszkiewicz and Joseph František, lost their lives in combat against the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who once was so reluctant to allow Polish pilots into battle, summarized their contribution in probably the most telling way. Had it not been for the magnificent work of the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of battle would have been the same. Polish fighter pilots became instant celebrities with all classes of British society. International journalists flocked to airfield to write about their exploits. Waiters refused to take payments for their meals in restaurants. Bar owners paid for their drinks and bus conductors allowed them free journeys. Quentin Reynolds, one of the war's most well-known American war correspondents, dubbed Polish airmen the real glamour boys of England in Collier's Weekly, an apt reflection of the hero-worship attitude the British had towards them. After the Battle of Britain, the Polish Air Force continued to serve alongside the RAF until the last day of the war. By early 1941, the PAF listed 13 units, 8 fighter, 4 bomber, and 1 reconnaissance squadron. In 1943 and 1944, further 2 observation squadrons were formed. Polish airmen in these squadrons participated in practically all IAF operations in the European theater of the war. Their contribution to the war against Nazi Germany was significant, although achieved at a very heavy price. The 1,903 personnel killed are today commemorated on the Polish War Memorial at IAF Northolt. After the war, some of the Polish airmen settled in Britain and continued their service in the RAF, mostly as flight instructors. However, during the planning of the London Victory Parade held in 1946, none of the Polish forces who had fought for Britain were initially invited to attend. The Free Polish government in exile had been opposed to the Soviet Union since the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 that agreed to partition Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The British government had decided to recognize the new Soviet-controlled Polish government at the end of the war and, seeking not to cause a diplomatic incident with the Soviet Union, chose not to extend an invite to the Free Polish forces. Instead, it invited representatives from the Soviet-controlled Polish government. The decision caused much outrage in Britain and, after protests from Winston Churchill, members of the IAF and others, last-minute invites were extended to 25 Free Polish pilots. However, these were refused by the recipients in protest that all Free Polish forces were not invited. Not all Poles decided to stay in Britain. Many decided to return to Soviet-controlled Poland. This often had very serious consequences. The communist regime, distrustful towards ex-servicemen of the Polish armed forces in the West, barred them from flying in the PAF and in numerous cases imprisoned them on trumped-up charges of espionage. One of the most drastic cases is that of Wing Commander Stanislaw Skalski, the top Polish scorer of the entire war, who spent 8 years in prison after initially being sentenced to death. It was not until Stalin's death in 1953 that most of the airmen were able to regain their ranks and serve again in the Polish Air Force. The contribution of the Poles to Britain's war effort was emblematic of a larger phenomenon, the integration of foreign forces into the Allied cause. Beyond the IAF, soldiers, sailors, and engineers from occupied countries, notably Czechoslovakia, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, served alongside their British counterparts, often bringing valuable experience gained in the early stages of the conflict. Czechoslovak airmen, for instance, flew with distinction in both fighter and bomber squadrons, helping to augment Britain's stretched air defenses. Meanwhile, Dutch and Norwegian forces operated alongside the Royal Navy in convoy protection, coastal patrols, and raids against German-occupied territories. The presence of these international forces not only bolstered manpower but introduced new ideas and tactics, often forcing the British military to adapt and innovate. One example was the improvisation of combined tactics between armored and air units, an approach that would later prove decisive in the Normandy campaign. Lessons learned from early tank failures, particularly in North Africa, informed these adjustments. The British Army gradually refined its approach to armored warfare, emphasizing combined arms operations, mechanized infantry, and close air support, lessons that were painfully learned but became essential to operational success. Back in the European theater, the summer of 1944 marked a turning point. The D-Day landings on the 6th of June represented the culmination of years of preparation, industrial effort, and doctrinal refinement. British armoured divisions, now equipped with Cromwells, Churchills, and Shermans, including the potent Sherman Firefly, spearheaded the assault in Normandy alongside American and Canadian forces. While these tanks were by no means perfect, their speed, reliability, and numbers offset the superiority of German armour. Panthers and Tigers remained formidable opponents, but attrition, supply issues, and the Allies' combined firepower gradually tilted the balance. The Normandy campaign highlighted both the progress and the lingering shortcomings of British tank development. Cromwell's, agile and fast, were ideally suited for reconnaissance and rapid exploitation, yet their armour remained inadequate against the heavier German guns. Churchills provided resilience in the Bocage country, able to negotiate the hedgerows and withstand hits that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. The Sherman Firefly 17 PDR gun allowed British crews to engage the enemy's heaviest armor on equal terms, but Fireflies were always in short supply, and the vulnerability of the standard Sherman persisted. One notable engagement that demonstrated the evolving British approach to tank warfare was the Battle for Villers-Bocage in June 1944. The operation underscored the importance of combined arms tactics, with infantry, armor, and artillery working in coordination. Yet it also revealed enduring weaknesses: poor intelligence, the limited availability of heavy guns, and mechanical failures continued to plague units in the field. The lessons learned here informed the refinement of British armored doctrine for the rest of the campaign in northwest Europe. By late 1944, the Allies had achieved a level of operational sophistication that allowed them to leverage both quantity and quality of armor. British forces, in particular, had standardized tank production and introduced improved crew training, maintenance protocols, and battlefield communication. Tank regiments now included a mixture of Cromwell's, Comets, Churchills, and Sherman Fireflies, creating a flexible force capable of both direct engagement and rapid exploitation. The universal tank concept, exemplified by the post-war Centurion, had begun to influence late-war designs like the Comet, whose balance of firepower, protection, and mobility provided a glimpse of what a truly effective British tank could achieve. Meanwhile, British air power continued to play a critical role in supporting armoured operations. The RAF's Tactical Air Forces, including the newly formed 2nd Tactical Air Force, provided close air support, interdiction, and reconnaissance. Fighter bombers such as the Hawker Typhoon and the North American Mustang worked in tandem with tanks and infantry, disrupting German movements and softening defensive positions ahead of ground assaults. Polish pilots, veterans of the Battle of Britain, were now flying over France and the Low Countries. Their skills honed in earlier battles now applied to precision strikes and reconnaissance missions. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but its lessons would shape British armoured doctrine for decades. The failure to produce effective tanks in the early years of the conflict was attributable to a combination of bureaucratic inertia, technological constraints, and doctrinal uncertainty. Yet the evolution from the light, underarm machines of 1939 to the Cromwell and Comet of 1944 demonstrates a remarkable, if belated, adaptability. The Centurion, finally entering service just as the war ended, represented the culmination of all these lessons: mobility, firepower, protection, and flexibility combined in a single design. Its immediate post-war success validated the universal tank concept, demonstrating that Britain had finally learned from its mistakes. The story of British armoured forces is inseparable from the wider Allied experience. Reliance on foreign tanks like the Sherman in collaboration with international forces, particularly the Poles, allowed Britain to overcome the deficiencies in its own early designs. The interplay between industrial capacity, doctrinal development, and operational experience shaped the final outcome of the war. Tanks alone did not win battles, but in combination with infantry, artillery, and air power, they were decisive instruments of mobility and firepower. Equally important was the human element. The bravery, skill, and ingenuity of British and Allied crews often compensated for technological shortcomings. The improvisation and determination displayed by tank commanders, gunners, and maintenance crews under fire were as crucial as any technical specification. Soldiers had to work with what they had, often learning the limitations of their vehicles in combat and then devising solutions on the fly. This adaptability, though born of necessity, contributed significantly to the overall effectiveness of British armoured forces by the war's end. The interwar period and the early years of the Second World War highlight a broader lesson in military history. Innovation must be paired with adequate funding, clear doctrine, and institutional flexibility. Britain's tank story is as much about missed opportunities and bureaucratic inertia as it is about eventual triumph. The contrast with the Soviet Union's T-34, which achieved immediate effectiveness through simplicity, speed, and mass production, underscores the cost of hesitation. Yet by 1944, Britain had finally closed the technological and operational gap, demonstrating that a mature, well-coordinated industrial effort could overcome early setbacks. In retrospect, the wartime development of British tanks mirrors the wider Allied experience. Initial struggle, costly trial and error, followed by adaptation, standardization, and effective execution. From the fragile light tank Mk6 to the formidable Centurion, the journey reflects a combination of ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless pressure of necessity. It is a story of failure, recovery, and eventual triumph, one in which both technology and human determination played indispensable roles. The post-war era would see the fruits of these labors fully realized. Centurion tanks formed the backbone of British armored units for decades, serving in conflict from Korea to the Middle East and influencing tank design worldwide. Yet the lessons of the Second World War, the dangers of delay, overcomplication, and doctrinal uncertainty remained a cautionary tale for military planners. Above all, the wartime evolution of British armor underscores the essential interplay between design, production, and operational experience, demonstrating that even the most advanced technology is worthless without effective application in the hands of trained and courageous personnel. As historians examine the trajectory of British tanks during the war, it becomes clear that the story is not one of outright failure nor unqualified success. It is, rather, a narrative of adaptation under pressure, shaped by external constraints, international collaboration, and the unforgiving demands of modern warfare. The British experience underscores a central truth of conflict. Innovation is not a linear process, and victory often comes not to the quickest or strongest, but to those capable of learning from their errors and applying their lessons effectively under fire. The Centurion, emblematic of this hard-won synthesis, serves as a final testament to the arduous journey of British tank development, a machine born too late to shape the outcome of the war, yet perfectly suited to dominate the battlefield in the uncertain years that followed. Its legacy, coupled with the heroism of the men and women who operated, maintained, and fought alongside it, stands as a powerful reminder that technological triumph alone is meaningless without the courage, skill, and perseverance to wield it effectively.